Hey, you're listening to The View from Peru, a podcast about real missionaries doing real ministry for a really great God. My name is Chris Fry, and I've been a missionary in Lima, Peru for about 4 years now, after having grown up here as a missionary kid myself. And I thought I would create this podcast as a way to tell people more about this country, tell people more about ministry, and also maybe people in the States can learn a little bit more about how to pray for the missionaries that are already connected to their church. So today, I have for you guys an interview with my boss, the director of International Christian School of Lima, Eric Alfrey. Eric has served God in 4 different countries in a variety of different roles, ranging from Bible teacher to principal to school director to pastor. And I think you guys are really going to love his insights into ministry and culture from all the different experiences that he and his family have. But first, I want to share with you guys a very unique Peru versus the Corona crisis update. Paola and I have worked with Kids Alive Peru on several occasions in our life. And Paola even worked with them as a missionary for a year before we got married. And the community that Paola worked with, Pucallpa, has really been hit hard by the presidential mandated quarantine and lockdown. Many of the families that Paola knew and grew to love during her time there are now without a job. And even in the best of times, this area of Pucallpa would already be a very hard place to live economically. At the daycare center that she worked at, it was pretty normal that the food provided there would be the only food these kids got to eat. And now that day center has been closed down due to the martial law complete lockdown quarantine across all of Peru, these kids are going without food, and their parents, assuming that they even had some sort of job, now have absolutely no work at all. And lately, the police and military have even been cracking down on the locals fishing as a last resort for food. So the kids and their families are going days in a row without any sort of food. So Paola and I, along with the team there in Pucallpa, are working together to make a fundraiser. Our goal is to raise $1,500, which is enough money to provide at least 40 basic needs kits to give out to families there in Pucallpa. These kits will include non-perishable items such as canned goods, rice, potatoes, etc., along with some basic hygiene stuff so that they don't get sick during this time. Please prayerfully consider how much you can contribute. And if you cannot contribute financially at all, please at least help us spread the word that this situation is happening and that people around the world have a way that they can help out. The links to the GoFundMe are going to be in the show notes below. Please pray for Pucallpa, Peru, and please pray for Kids Alive Peru as they do their best to help out as many families as possible during these really tough economic times. All right, without further ado, I am now just going to switch it over to the interview, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
I'm Eric Alfrey, and my wife is Martha. This is our first year in Peru. We grew up in the same little town in southern Ohio. And we went to different elementary schools and different high schools and colleges. We did go to junior high together for a few years. So we knew one another. Our families knew each other, really. But we got together after college and soon thereafter got married. And that's been, I guess this year will be 35 years. Wow.
Wow. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah, in November, 35.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, could you tell us a little bit about the different countries you've been a missionary to and the different ways you've served God? I think you've been a principal and also a pastor, and just whatever you would like to share about that would be great.
Well, just coming out of university, I went to Liberty University, and after that, began in children's ministry. So I went on staff with the church and served for a couple of years as in outreach in children's ministries, doing neighborhood Bible club ministry, and we used students to teach the club. So we did a lot of training. So summer Bible clubs, after school clubs, that kind of thing. So I did that for a couple of years, but was interested in going on to get a master's. And so we looked at a school to do that, moved from Virginia back to our hometown, and was, planning to start graduate school, but I was associate pastor in a small church my parents had attended, and I was paid by living in the parsonage, basically, doing that part-time, youth and children's ministry. And I began to work in a small Christian school at the same time. Was actually teaching a couple classes and asked to be the interim principal of the school. And so I was in one of my first years, I was a principal and a teacher. And, we realized that those two jobs, one mostly full-time, the other one part-time, it was going to be too hard to fit graduate school in there. So we kind of looked at different options. And after a couple of years, I went to Grand Rapids Theological Seminary to do a master's in Christian education. And it was really during that time that the Lord helped us to really evaluate, should we pursue church ministry or Christian school ministry? And one of my mentors or professors was Anthony Fertosis. And Dr. Fertosis was just amazing. One of those who had served for many, many, many years. And he would tell stories about ministry in Christian school and how God had used that and just the whole heart of that. And that's what the Lord really used to grab our attention. So after we were there a short time, began to look for schools to teach Bible. And through a friend, ended up in South Haven, Mississippi. A Christian school there at the time was called Southern Baptist Educational Center. Now it's North Point Christian School. But went there to teach middle school and high school Bible. My wife Martha was teaching in the elementary. And so that's where we began our Christian school ministry full-time, was in Mississippi. And we had talked with Joe Hale about possibly going to Korea with Nix, but felt like we needed to get some experience and get a little settled since we had moved a few times in our married life. And but it was interesting because just a short time after we got to Mississippi, Joe Hale walked into our church, and it was, interesting, surprising to see him. And we said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, this is my parents' church, and I'm going to be coming back here to set up a U.S. office for a ministry of planting Christian schools in international cities around the world." And so, of course, that had our attention, and we were able to begin to get involved with Nix from the very beginning. I was asked to serve on the board of Nix for a while, and did that for a few years. And every year we would hear reports about what God was doing in these different schools, and God continued to just place that on our hearts. And so in 2002, we went to China with Nix.
What were some of the things about China that surprised you or gave you culture shock that really threw you through a loop? And also, what were some of the things that you really love about China and that, you might even miss now after having been away from it for some time?
So when we went to China, we had 3 children, and our oldest was about 10. So they were like 10, 7, and 4. And so we had never even visited China. We just said, okay, God is leading us to go, so let's go. And, we were all excited about it. One of the things that really, I think, helped us, and we've talked about this, is a matter of expectations. Because we had never even visited there, we had no real idea what to expect. So in a way, we went with very simple expectations. And so, we showed up with our suitcases. Somebody picked us up at the airport and took us back, took us to our apartment and said, here's where you're going to live, and that was fine. It was a roof and walls, and we had beds, and so, okay. And the fact that we went with such little expectation, everything was kind of a surprise. Everything was kind of, it was okay. We thought, oh, well, we'll probably just have a light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Well, we had lights. That was good, and those kinds of things. So we were, I'll say, pleasantly surprised by a lot of things. And, China is amazing. The things that you first notice is just the sheer numbers of people. There are just people everywhere. So crowds and managing that can be a challenge, but I think we adapted pretty well to all that. And obviously language. We were in a city. I like to call Kunming a little village of 6 million people. But we went there and began to learn some Mandarin, but there wasn't much English around. So that was definitely a challenge. Now our kids picked it up much better even than we did. But I would say we got to a survival level in our Mandarin while we were there. And
sorry, just want to ask right quick, how long do you think it took you to get to that survival level? Was it like within the first year or 3 years of understanding Mandarin?
So we were taking Mandarin just 1 or 2 hours a week, really, because our full-time work was in an international school in English. So what we were spending most of our time doing was in English. And we would do some classes each week after school. And then, with staff, with friends, practicing. I would say, the first year we learned those basics of taxi and how to get around and numbers for the market and things like that. And probably more so, it took a couple of years to, have some level of comfort. Yeah. So it definitely took a while the way we did it. Those were some of the challenges. It was really pre-Facebook and that, we did have email. So felt like we could stay connected with friends and family to some degree back in the States and phone calls, but, wasn't the level of communication that's available now. So that was a little different. But again, our kids did really well. They adjusted. And I think one of the big things for that was we were there as part of an international school. So they had an international community that they were part of, and they were going to school and doing activities and things that they would be doing in the States, but just in a very different setting and a real rich cultural setting with students from around the world. And so we really appreciated that, and they certainly enjoyed that. They also had a lot more freedom than they would have in the States. Interestingly, kids could go out in our apartment complex and play and ride their bikes and do things that I remember growing up that they probably wouldn't have done in the U.S. The same way. So they enjoyed things, and Martha and I really enjoyed and felt fulfilled by the work that we were able to do, with our staff and with our students at the school.
And could you tell us a little bit more about that school? When you say international, how international was it? Just off the top of your head, like how many different countries were roughly represented, do you think?
The school had just over 100 students when we went, and the majority of them were American, but there were students from around the world, many different countries, Europe, other countries throughout Asia, and a number of Christian workers who were there at that time. And so really a vibrant community. The school continued to grow, and during the time we were there had grown to over 200 students, probably 20 different countries represented.
That's pretty cool. And that's about the same as ICS Lima, right?
That's right. Yeah, very similar.
Sweet. And I was wondering, from your experience, how was religion or Christianity accepted there? Because I think sometimes there's a lot of conflicting information that we have in the United States about how China takes Christianity. And I was just wondering, what was your perspective of that? Like, how open were the people? How much did the government really seem to care that you were a Christian school? Any insights about that would be great.
So, in regard to the religious environment in China, the one thing to note about our experience was that we went there almost 20 years ago. And so I think our experience would be very different than it might be today. At the time, there was a good bit more openness. We attended an international church that was registered with the government. So there were restrictions on our church. We followed the guidelines of the Bureau of Religion, but we met in another church for a while, and then we moved to a hotel, and so we were able to have regular services in Sunday school. We did have to show passports at the door to ensure that it was only expats attending our services, and that was the same for the school. We could only enroll expats in the school. So within those restrictions, working within those parameters, we had quite a bit of freedom. And I don't think that's exactly the case today. In our neighborhood where we lived, there was a Christian bookstore operated by locals that sold all kinds of Christian materials, variety of Christian authors that were all translated into Chinese. Before we left one Christmas, there was a public performance of Handel's Messiah by a joint effort of local Chinese churches. And so, I could give examples of some of the things that were occurring then. I do not think that is the case today.
Man, that's kind of crazy that you had to show your passports to go to your expat church. What was the reasoning behind that? That you had to show your passports to go into your church and you couldn't have any local Chinese students in the school?
Yeah, they did seek to control religion, of course. And so while I say there was a level of freedom, it was more recognized that, well, you're foreigners, so that's your way of doing it. The Chinese way, is Communist Party, atheism, etc. So, and government control. So that part, I think, wasn't different then than it is now. There was always a level, of government control that is just part of their system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so from what you've heard since being there, like things have been, more constricted from what you've heard on the news and everything since your time
Right.
there.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's been a good bit written and has been discussed about those kinds of restrictions on freedom of religion for foreigners and for Chinese citizens at this time.
And how many years were you in China?
We were there for 5 years, from 2002 to 2007.
Very cool. And what were some of the parts about the culture that stand out to you, being 10-ish or so years apart from your experience there?
Well, one of the best things about the experience and the opportunity to be there were the Chinese friends that we were able to make. So co-workers and friends that we built relationships with, and some of those that were able, to even continue, and really appreciate the people that that we met. And when you think about the history of China, what they've experienced, you just have a great appreciation for the families, the individuals, and so I would say that was certainly a highlight to us.
Awesome. Yeah, I think for me that's pretty similar about Peru, right? Is the warmth of the people and the friends and the family that you form while on the mission field is one of the things that always comes to the forefront of your mind.
Well, I mentioned just the sheer numbers of people earlier.
Right.
So when you're on the street, when you're in a bus, when you're in a crowd, you could just be plowed over. There's not a lot of recognition for lines or space or order, and you can feel kind of like a non-person. But I think it's just because of the sheer numbers of people, and so they're kind of conditioned to ignore the crowd. But when you get to know people personally, you won't find any more trusted and close, caring friend. And so I think they've had to, culturally distinguish between, the crowds and people that they know.
Yeah, that's interesting how their culture has divided it up like that. So after China, where next did God lead you?
Yeah. So we knew that really our last year there was going to be time to transition back to the States for a period. We were doing well. Our kids were doing well. But our parents were reaching an age where we felt like we needed to be closer, and looking at the timing of our children's education, if we stayed for one to finish high school, then the others would be uprooted, etc. And so we just thought the timing was best. So we announced that we would be, leaving the school, and began to look, where do you want us to go, Lord? I put out some resumes, made some contacts right at the beginning of that last school year. And by spring break, we still didn't know where we were going, and really seeking the Lord. It was an interesting time. We were getting to April, and packing up things that we wanted to send back, and said, well, we need an address. Where are we supposed to send our things? And it was only a few weeks before we were leaving China that God directed us to a Christian school in Columbia, South Carolina, Ben Lippen School, a school with a long history of MK education, a boarding program. So they had nearly 100 students from around the world who were studying there. And it was just a great environment for us to be a part of, and for our kids as well. And so we came to Ben Lippen, and I served as the elementary principal, and Martha was teaching a second grade.
That's really cool. And how do you think your time in China compares to your time teaching in the States? Like, what were some of the differences, like parent reactions to stuff, or other cultural stuff that might influence the two different school settings?
Well, really, the day-to-day of Christian school, whether it's in the U.S. or overseas, is very similar. So I would say, the schools that we were part of in the U.S. were a good bit larger than the ones overseas. So that would be one difference, is that, the school environment overseas, the community was a bit closer, and, because it was a smaller community. But yeah, the day to day, you're doing accreditation, you're doing curriculum, you're doing student discipline, you're doing parent meetings, you're doing the work of a Christian school. And so that part was easier. I would say that the overseas relationships, and I think you already referred to that, just so rich. People from all over the world that are serving together. You're there without your extended family, so your coworkers really become like family. The time that you spend together, supporting, caring for one another, and just doing life together. And so we really, enjoyed that. And in coming back to the U.S., that I would say was a challenge, because people are more set in their routines and their churches or their community, their neighborhood. And it's that part, even in the church setting, isn't quite the same.
And speaking of churches, what do you think is something that the American church could learn from the Chinese church, or even the Peruvian church, if you want to jump ahead a few years, at least from what you've seen in your experience?
Wow. I have to think about that a minute. Thinking about the Chinese church and the believers that we got to know, you see what a high level of commitment they have, and we use that word commitment sometimes, but I think they really understood what that meant, and it wasn't that church was just something they did culturally, because it wasn't part of the culture, right? It wasn't something they just did, out of habit, but something that had a much deeper level of commitment than we often see in the U.S., especially, I'll say, in the South, where, Christianity is culturally such a part of the community.
Yeah, that's something that I've noticed too. It seems like even here in Peru, I was just thinking about, for one of the earlier podcast episodes, about how even in the youth groups that I compared to being in Peru and in the States, even though a lot of the kids that went to our youth group are not necessarily still in the church, for that time at least, there was a level of dedication, right? Whereas when I was in the States, it seemed like the kids were there because they didn't have anything else to do on a Wednesday. Whereas in Peru, they were there to at least learn about God, right? Or at least because the church provided a good sense of community and safe friendships. Whereas a lot of times when I went to youth groups in the States, it seemed that the kids were there because they were made to be there, or really because they had nothing else to do on a Wednesday besides homework.
Right. And a lot of the trappings in the church are these, you know, systems, things that we do, like you said, programs. It's so programmed. And I think in overseas churches, you have a lot less of that programming, and it's more personal.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that from at least what I've seen. And granted, there's always exceptions, and we're talking broadly here as well.
Sure.
So, how long were you the principal in? Was it South Carolina?
Yes, South Carolina.
Yeah. So, how long were you a principal there, and where did God lead you next?
Well, we were in Columbia, South Carolina, for 9 years, and the first 3 years I served as principal at Ben Lippen School, and then there was a need and an opportunity at our church there in Columbia for a children's minister, and we just felt at the time that is something that God was opening the door of opportunity. It was an area that I had been involved in the past and could help. We loved our church there, and we're very, involved. And so I'd made the switch from Ben Lippen School to First Baptist Columbia as children's minister, and served the next 6 years, in that role. Martha continued at Ben Lippen.
How does being a children's pastor compare and contrast to being a principal? Like, if it was like a Venn diagram, what would be the stuff that there's really no overlap, and then what are like the overlapping principles that you saw in both of those roles?
I would say between those roles, administratively, there are similarities. I mean, in a school, you're dealing with curriculum, subject matter, planning, but you have to do that in church, right? What are you going to teach, and what materials are you going to use, and how do you train teachers and equip people? So all those kinds of things are very, very similar. I think as a leader in a Christian school, you really need to have a pastoral kind of heart. You need to care for people. You need to seek to encourage their spiritual growth. You need to serve. And so I think so much of that is, a pastoral role in school leadership as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that that's true, that both positions really do require, like you said, a pastoral role, a servant leadership mindset. And really both are making disciples of younger humans, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I will tell you a big difference, and this is what, in a lot of ways, God used to lead me back to Christian school ministry, and that is the limited opportunity you have. Now, I know Jesus said, "I'll build my church, and the gates of hell won't overcome it." So his commitment is to the church, not to a school. But a Christian school can be a complement and an arm of the church. And we just have such a great opportunity in Christian school ministry that frankly doesn't exist in the church. And so I would see our families in a large church with several thousand people, several hundred children that I had responsibility for, and with their parents. But we would have a large majority of students that we might see in Sunday school once a month. Well, that's an hour. Where are they next week? Where are they the next week? They're at the lake. They're at this. They weren't feeling well. They slept in. And so the exposure that you have, the opportunity you have, even in a large church, is very limited. And I would say, even if you took those most highly committed families, that are diehards and they're there, 3 times a week, then you've just got exposure to them, 3 or 4 hours a week. And I began to realize that in a school setting, you have such a great opportunity to disciple, to get to know the students, to spend time and to invest in their lives, because, that's how Jesus discipled. He didn't, meet with the 12 once a week for an hour, on Sunday morning. We spent a lot of time together. And so, that was kind of the burden that God began to put on our hearts, as well as the growing desire to return to cross-cultural ministry and to serve in an environment like, ICS Lima.
And speaking of which, that is where God led you next, right? After South Carolina? Was it straight to Peru, or am I missing a step there?
Yeah, there was one more step in between. So we just began to seek opportunities for Christian school ministry, and that was a process of a few years, actually, before the Lord really opened those doors. But we were excited to rejoin with Nix in Singapore, and we went to International Community School Singapore.
Oh, that's right. It was Singapore.
Yeah. So I first served as the director of admissions, and I really loved that role because I got to spend a lot of time with parents and really talking to them about, the right fit for their children's education and what that looks like in a Christian school. And after I did that for 2 years, I was asked to be the interim director there in Singapore.
And for how long were you the interim director?
Just that 1 year, and
okay.
they selected another director at that time. And so once again, we were at that point of, okay, Lord, where do you want us, where you would have us to serve? And the Lord opened the door for Martha and I to come to Lima.
Very cool. And this is your first year here in Lima, and from what I've seen, you're killing it. You're doing awesome. So glad that you are the director and that Isabel is the principal, and you've definitely have come for such a time as this with everything going on with the Corona crisis, and just really appreciate everything that you and your wife have brought to the table. Just to clarify, Eric's wife is Martha, not Isabel. Isabel is the principal that started at the same time. How has adjusting to Peru after to Singapore from the States been going? Let me reword that question. What has helped you adjust quickly to such different cultures time and time again? I mean, just how have you been able to go through like culture shock and culture acceptance from China to going back home to the States to Singapore to Peru?
Well, I would want to say thanks for those kind words, Chris, and your encouragement. And I think the next thing I'll say is related to your question in the way that, it's really not just me. It is a team, and you referred to Isabel, but really a great leadership team and a great faculty. So I came into a school to work with a tremendous group of people who are, very qualified and highly committed to the ministry of ICS Lima. And I think that's, a real big factor in our adjustment here, is that we're able to be part of a community and a team, enjoying together toward a common goal. And so, I think that has definitely helped us.
Yeah, so being part of community really helps with the adjustment. And that's something that you saw in all of your travels and relocations, right?
Well, I referred to that when we came back to the States. I think community is just a little different than it is overseas. So maybe even a little more challenging. Lima is definitely more like the community in Kunming in the sense that, it's a smaller community. People are more connected, I think, here than in the U.S. And even in Singapore. Singapore is a very urban, city. We went to a large denominational church of several thousand people, in Singapore. So, there are just things that are different in some cultures than others. And so I think the nature of Lima and ICS community are a great advantage.
And so far, what has been your favorite part about Peru besides the people?
You have to say food, right?
That was my bet.
Yeah.
So what do you like about the Peruvian food?
Well, our first meal, I remember after church on a Sunday, was polla de brasa. So, you have to love that. And it is true. It's not just roasted chicken. It's something that's very good. So, we like that. I like potatoes all kinds of ways. So, coming to Peru, how many hundreds of kinds of potatoes
Yeah,
are there?
it's like 500 something. It's
Yeah.
insane.
But, and then the fact that, we do have a lot of local food is great, but then we have other options too, so it's a very diverse offering of different foods and opportunities and some familiar ones. And as you know, one of my favorites opened this year. We even have an IHOP now.
Yeah, yeah. Having IHOP is game changer. As good as Peruvian food is, personally, like I think that most Peruvian dishes, like culinarily speaking, would trump most American dishes, right? Just from like aesthetic and like food design and everything for lunch and supper. But to be honest, Peruvian breakfast is lacking,
Yeah.
and I think that America dominates the breakfast world. And yeah, it's been great having IHOP, and I can't wait to get out of this Corona lockdown and get me some gigantic unhealthy pancakes. Really looking forward to that.
For sure. And yeah, I would definitely say breakfast is the one food I've missed the most in different places we've lived.
All right. For my last question, I was just wondering if you had any words of advice or encouragement to parents who are trying to do online schooling with their kids or homeschooling for the first time. Um, I think either parents here in Peru from our own school or, you know, families that might be listening to this in the States. Just any tips, advice, encouragement for parents that are kind of at wit's end at this point, not really sure what to do or how to do it with everyone being out of school and trying to do it online.
Well, I think my first advice would be to manage your expectations. And just like I referred to that when we went to China, we were, when things exceeded our expectation, we were so pleased, and that was an encouragement. So manage your expectations. You are not going to be able to accomplish 100% of what would be accomplished if your children were, in school with their instructor and, all the resources and student interaction and that. So you have to understand you want to make the best opportunity that you can. And then along those lines with the idea of expectation is sorting out what is important. I joined an educators group of those who are now for the first time doing online education. And, there's so many resources by the thousands, questions. Oh, here, try this, do this, do this. And, it can be overwhelming. And so I would say really sort through that to focus on what is important. Your child's teachers are going to focus on some basics and important things. So focus on those. Focus on doing limited things well, doing those things to a high quality, but doing less than you might do otherwise.
Awesome, thanks. I think that's really good advice. And lastly, how could whoever listens to this pray for you, the Alfrey family, throughout the next week or two?
Well, thanks for asking that, Chris. I mentioned our children, and when we moved to China, they were very young. They are grown and living on their own in South Carolina. One is married. Our two daughters are both nurses, so you can pray for them and the work and ministry that they do in caring for others, and then our son as well. And so, just pray for them in their community and their church. Parenting from another continent is a challenge, but it's good because we're at a stage where we're getting to see our children, as they now are adults, and so our role obviously changes, and but we still want to support them and be part of what God is doing in their lives.
All right. Anything else? Any other ways we could pray?
Yeah, just praying for our team here and the leaders, praying for our needs as a school. I think these are uncertain times, and nobody knows how this is actually going to affect, staffing, how it's going to affect enrollment. Do we have to be very creative in ways that we do what we do? We've made a lot of changes very quickly. And so now what do we need to do going forward? So those would be requests that I would have for the ministry.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you giving me an hour or so of your weekend, especially the spring break weekend. Really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you in May, I guess.
Yeah, crazy.
Well, I mean, I'll see you Monday through our devotional meetings with the school, but
right.
Yeah, I look forward to being in person. It's definitely very different, and there's definitely a lot of stuff I like about teaching online. But man, I miss actually seeing my students and seeing my coworkers, and praying feels a lot different over Google Meet versus in our actual meeting.
Yeah, I hope we have a greater appreciation for those things. And you've probably seen some things people have shared about want things to get back to normal, and then say, no, maybe there's some things that we don't want to be normal. Maybe there's some things we've learned from this that we don't need to put back in our lives. But there are certain things that obviously we do. So it will be good to get to be back together.
Yeah, I can't agree more. All right, thank you so much. Tell Martha hi. Tell your kids hi. I think Hannah Beth was on a previous episode. I think I know she sent a 1 or 2 minute voice memo about growing up as a missionary kid. I'm not sure how many episodes ago that will be when this is published, but it was fun including her in that.
We'll look for it.
Again, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking me, Chris. It was fun to talk about, and I appreciate what you're doing.
Again, thank you, Eric, so much for the great interview. Please do not forget that in our show notes is the link to the GoFundMe The GoFundMe is titled Helping Families Hurt by COVID-19 Quarantine. Please pray and think about how you can help, whether that is by a financial donation or even just by spreading the word that this opportunity to, as the Bible puts it, help and protect the widows and orphans. Thank you so much for listening and for all the feedback I've been receiving. If you have any questions, please go ahead and send them to my email. I'm collecting all these questions and I want to do a podcast episode where I answer all the questions that I've received. So please keep sending me them. They've been great. Please send them to my email at cmfry427@gmail.com. Again, that is cmfrey427@gmail.com. Also, feel free to contact us through any of our social media outlets, pretty much everywhere, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can find us at Chris and Paola Fry, The View from Peru. And if this podcast has been a blessing to you spiritually, please share it with someone else that you think might be spiritually blessed by it as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you again next week. And I hope that God has been glorified through the recording of this podcast today.